Hello everyone and welcome to a new video. Today's video is going to be another installment in the Sewing Through the Decades series, and this time I'm taking on the 1930s. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, I will link a video up above that explains it in more detail, but basically this series consists of me sewing my way through the 20th century using original vintage sewing patterns. And the sewing pattern I'm following today is Advanced 2033. I'd never followed an advanced pattern before, and I'd also never made a 1930s dress before, so this was just an all-around adventure for me. I really like 1930s fashion. I feel like it incorporates a lot of the elements I liked from the 1920s, but has a cleaner, more flattering silhouette and a lot of seaming details that are more reminiscent of the 1940s. This was actually one of the harder patterns to shop for. I feel like the 1930s is the point when people start shopping for patterns that they can actually use to make wearable garments, whereas everything before that is more looked as a novelty paper item. So there was more competition for 1930s patterns, and I was also a little bit picky about buying one. As I said, I like 1940s fashion so much that I tended to gravitate towards late 1930s patterns, which could pass for 1940s. And I really tried to hold back that urge and find something that I felt was iconically 1930s. And I think I did a pretty good job. As I said, this pattern is Advanced 2033, and it features a narrow skirt that flares out slightly at the hem, a fitted waist, inserted gather details at the bust, and a cape. I must admit, the cape kind of sold this entire garment on me. Look at it! It's just so fun! This pattern was also pretty affordable and it came in my size. So I grabbed it up and I'm really happy that I did. This pattern is advertised as an afternoon dress and it consists of 9 pieces with 2 bodice variations. You can either make it with sleeves or the cape, but honestly, why would you make it with sleeves when you could have a cape? It recommends lightweight fabrics and takes about 3 or 4 yards of material to make. Before getting into the video, I just want to remind you guys that this series is sponsored by my lovely patrons over on Patreon. And if you'd like to see this series continue and would like to see me take on bonus projects, which I will be doing for the 1930s, so keep an eye out next week, along with exclusive behind-the-scenes content, then I would really encourage you to check out my Patreon and consider supporting me there. And on that note, I can finally get into the video, and I really hope you enjoy. So as I said in the intro, today I'll be taking you through the process of making Advanced 2033. It's also the first advanced pattern of this series, and the most instruction heavy by far. Like, there's an actual sheet of instructions, and lots of info on the back of the pattern too, including labeled pieces, material requirements, and corresponding body measurements. Aside from the instructions, I think the design is pretty exciting too. The feminine gathers across the shoulder, the inserted gathers across the bust, and the soft, lightly flared skirt. I love how different it is from the 1920s pieces, to the point where it could probably still be worn today without getting a second glance. But there's also something very historical and iconically 1930s about it, which I find really neat. Here is the precious sheet of instructions. Look at all of those words, the diagrams, the legible information on construction. Doesn't it make your heart beat faster? Definitely another big change from the 1920s patterns. As for fabric, I picked, or rather my patrons picked, this bright orange and white floral rayon. The drape of this fabric is perfect for this dress, and I think the ditzy floral print is pretty appropriate too. Although the instructions are more modern, the tissue paper is not advanced much. Way to not live up to your name, advanced. This pattern in tissue isn't printed. Instead, pleats, gathers, tucks, darts, and any other detail you can imagine are marked using perforations. However, as you can see here, I've made some markings on the pattern to signify where I need to add additional seam allowance, as well as what pieces need to be gathered down to, since that is not mentioned anywhere. The project officially started by laying all the pieces out onto the fabric. I paid attention to the marked grain line during this process, but I didn't follow any of their cutting diagrams exactly. My fabric was slightly wider than their diagrams, and the print prevented me from following their instructions, so I had to figure it out myself, which took a while. As I'm cutting this out, you might notice me adding seam allowance. That is to allow for French seams, since this fabric frays a bit and is thin enough to allow for French seams without it adding any real bulk. I should also mention that I'm cutting the pieces to be more narrow at the tops. Though the pattern fit well over my hips, I discovered the waist was really loose when making the mock-up. In fact, a lot of this was loose. I definitely suit the size 36 in vintage patterns more than the size 38. One thing I didn't have to change was the length. This pattern ran very long, which was a nice change. The finished dress might even be a little too long, which is definitely a first. The pattern instructions detail the bodice construction first, but since those skirt pieces are cut partially on the bias, I wanted to assemble it first and allow ample time for the pieces to hang before hemming. The instructions for the skirt were quite limited. All they say is, close seams of front of skirt and side fronts, also a back and side back, close side seams, left side open above medium perforation. And as I said earlier, I'm sewing my skirt with French seams, so I'm pinning them with the wrong sides facing each other first. Then sewing them together with the 1/2 inch allowance. Trimming the allowance down to be less than 1/4 inch. Then ironing the seam flat. The fabric is folded on the seam line with the right sides facing each other, then pinned, sewed, and ironed once again. This creates a very nice, tidy French seam. I've actually noticed that a lot of vintage garments have the edges left completely raw. I've gotten so many comments I should be whip stitching the seam allowance down, or using a serger, or some other finishing technique. But I must say that on most of the authentic vintage garments that I have, the edges on the interior are completely raw. I think they used lighter fabrics with a tighter weave that were just less prone to fraying in general, so it wasn't as necessary. Not to mention that sergers and zigzag stitch attachments weren't widely available at this time. This was repeated for all the seams except for the left side seam. This seam is left open at the top, which forms the lower half of the placket, which allows you to get the dress on and off. So I sewed this seam with a normal 1 inch seam allowance, not as a French seam, just to simplify the placket process later on. Also, can I just say that plackets are the worst thing? Like, plackets and invisible zippers sewn into heavyweight fabrics are my biggest closure peeves. I'm a pretty clumsy individual. Like, I've tripped on a crack in the pavement and broken my ankle before, but nothing makes me feel like a less competent, elegant individual than getting into a dress with the side placket, or getting out of one. Getting out of them is even worse. There isn't enough room for my shoulders and arms, and I hate them. With the skirt assembled, I hung it up to allow the bias cut portions to fall and stretch while I worked on the bodice. Now we can move on to the bodice instructions, starting with, cut a bias strip of material 2 inch wide and 1 inch longer than the line of small perforations near the opening at the lower edge of the front of the blouse. Base center of strip over the small perforations. Stitch each side of perforations, graduating from 1/2 inch at edge to a point at the inner perforation. Cut between stitching. When that is step 1, you know the pattern is going to be a good time. So breaking that step down, I started by cutting the bias strips. Then I got out my front bodice piece and marked the perforations onto the material near the horizontal dart thing. This is why I don't write pattern instructions for McCall's. Horizontal dart thing probably isn't in a true professional's vocabulary. It's hard to see this since the material is an abyss of floral that the bias strip blends into perfectly, but I laid the bias cut strip on the right side of the fabric so it extended past the line of perforations at the tip of the dart thing. Then I added pins on the back side of the material to secure it more fully, and removed the pins from the front. I found it was easiest to place it from the front, but you can't see where you're supposed to sew from the front, so I'll be sewing it on from the back side. Then I used a ruler and marking pen to indicate where my stitches should go. Like they instructed, the stitching starts a 1/2 inch away from the edge of the material, but tapers inward towards the end of the dart. Here I'm sewing across the lines I marked. Then I clipped inwards towards the point and turned the bias strip inward. I also turned the lower edge of the slash thing inward by a 1/2 inch. You don't have to worry about the top edge since it will be gathered down. The exact instructions for this part are, turn strip under on lower edge of slash and baste, graduating from 1/2 inch on side edge of blouse to point at thinner edge of slash. Turn from this strip down on upper edge of slash and gather, graduating from 1/2 inch at medium perforation to a point at end of slash. Stitch lower edge of opening flat over upper edge. Are you still with me? Now I'm ironing the bottom edge so it looks nice and tidy from the right side of the fabric. And here I'm gathering the top edge of the slash down so it matches the length of the lower edge of the slash. And I'm using running stitches pulled taut for this step. If you want clearer instructions on this, the process is called inserted gathers. It's a little challenging to search for since you don't see it a lot on modern garments, but inserted pleats and gathers were incredibly popular on garments from the 1920s through the 1950s. I'm kind of sad it isn't more common. It's a really interesting alternative to darts, which are what we use for shaping now, though it is definitely a little bit more complicated to execute. If you're interested in fabric manipulation techniques in general, there's a really fantastic book called The Art of Manipulating Fabric, which I will link down below. It's not garment specific, but it does talk a lot about pleating and gathering and how you can incorporate that to create various different effects. Anyway, back to the dress. I pinned the lower edge to the upper edge so it nicely covered the running stitches. Then I used my machine to top stitch the lower edge into position. I was going to do this by hand with slip stitches, but the diagram shows straight stitches across the edge, so that's what I did. The next instruction is, gather upper edge of blouse between the notches in medium perforations. This needs to be gathered down so it perfectly matches the dimensions of the yoke. They don't tell you what those dimensions are, and it's hard to figure out just by measuring the pattern pieces, so that's annoying. But I figured out what things had to be gathered down to when making the mock-up, so I didn't have to fiddle with that when making the final garment, which was really nice. And here is the freshly gathered front panel of the blouse. Now it says, gather lower edge of back of blouse. Again, it does not specify what to gather it down to. Before even starting, I made sure all the perforations were marked onto the fabric since they are pretty important later on, and much harder to mark once the piece is gathered down. And again, I'm using running stitches for this. Now onto the next step. Close the underarm seams of blouse, left side open below medium perforations. Finish the armhole with flat bias. I would just like to know why each step is actually 4 steps. That isn't how steps are supposed to work. And I mean like 4 as in number 4 steps, not 4 steps. Anyway, I pinned the side seams. Like with the skirt, I'm sewing these as normal 1-inch seams instead of French seams. That makes the placket easier to finish later on and allows for easier alterations if they are necessary in the future. I sewed the seams by machine and ironed them open. To finish the arm side, I cut 2-inch wide strips on the fabric's bias. The bias is the diagonal grain line of a fabric. Material cut on this grain line will stretch slightly even if the material itself is not stretchy. That's why I had to hang the skirt. Since the edges of it were cut diagonally, it's likely to stretch and warp when it's hung. You want that to happen before you trim and hem the skirt, otherwise it will end up being uneven over time. I ironed the edges of the strips inward to create single fold bias binding. This was eased around the arm side with the right sides facing each other, and it was stitched on with a 1/2-inch seam allowance. The seam allowance was notched, and I ironed the binding until it sat nicely over the curve at the arm side. Then the folded edge of the binding was pinned to the interior of the bodice. I sewed the interior of the bias binding with slip stitches, as indicated on the diagram. As you might be able to tell, my bias binding was really wide. I'm not sure what happened, but I should have cut it to be about a 1/2 inch more narrow. It definitely worked, it just doesn't look very elegant despite the efforts I put into finishing it nicely. Now onto the cape. This part was also cut on the fabric's bias, so I let it hang overnight after cutting it out. Then I trimmed the piece so the hem was even before I began working with it. Their instructions regarding the cape are, baste 1/2 inch under on side edges of capelet as far down as medium perforations. Narrow hem the edges below. Gather upper edge. To make the narrow hem a bit easier, I'm turning the bottom edge inward by a 1/4 inch using my iron. Then I folded the edge inward by another 1/4 inch and stitched it down with whip stitches, as shown in the diagram. This is actually the first pattern I followed which indicated how to sew things, and I was really surprised by the amount of handwork recommended. It's made me regret how much machine sewing I used to finish previous garments in this series. But sewing machines have existed and been a household item since the beginning of the 20th century, so I don't think the methods shown in previous videos were inaccurate, just not as common or as nice to look at, which is a shame and shows lack of research on my part, which I apologize for. However, at least my mid-century pieces will be finished nicely, and they are the ones I really plan on wearing. Speaking of finished, here is the completed hem. Now the tops were gathered, and you might be wondering what they should be gathered down to. That's a mystery. They don't tell you. Instead, we guess and then move on to the next step, which is stitch the basted edges of capelet to front and back blouse on the lines of medium perforations with numbered perforations matched in front. Baste top of capelet to blouse with small perforations at the armhole edges. Annoyingly, the capelet is a different length on each edge, but the pattern and perforations don't indicate which edge belongs at the front. I think this might be an error with the tissue paper pattern that I got. So I ended up placing the shorter edge at the front, which I hope is right. This part looks like a mess, but the straight edges are pinned vertically to the front and back of the bodice, and the gathered edge is left free to flow in the wind, at least until the yoke is stitched on. Again, the diagram showed this portion being secured with top stitching, so I did this by machine. And now we are onto the yoke. The instructions are: baste 1/2 inch under on lower edge of yoke. Stitch yoke flat on blouse with medium perforations even in yoke and capelet. But before doing any of that, I lightly starched the fabric with best press. I want it to be a bit more rigid since it kind of supports the entire bodice. Then I folded the edges inward by 1/2 inch using my iron. Now we are back to the mess of floral fabric, which is this bodice. The perforations were lined up and the yoke was pinned in place. Part of the yoke is stitched onto the bodice, where other parts are stitched to the capelet. That's what made figuring out the proper gathering dimensions so difficult, and it's also what makes them so crucial to get right, so I'm really frustrated that they didn't indicate that anywhere. I sewed the yoke on by machine, and I actually kept my stitches pretty far away from the edge of the fabric, which I now realize looks odd, so I'm probably going to restitch this with differently placed top stitching. The next instruction is finish the neck of frock with flat bias, clip down at center front to turn. So this is the same process you saw on the arm side, just with the neckline. I pinned the bias binding on with the right sides together, stitched a 1/2 inch away from the edge, and ironed it inward. But I didn't actually sew down the underside since I'm going to be stitching the ribbon on top of the neckline to create a similar finish to the example garment. And the stitching from that should also secure the bias binding. My ribbon is actually strips of shanting I sewed into tubes, since finding white satin ribbon that doesn't look really cheap is surprisingly difficult. Their instructions for the ribbon trim neckline are: stitch ribbon flat over the neck down to 1/2 inch from the point in front, tie and bow. I actually stitched a bow on separately, but I did follow their top stitching instructions, and I gathered the ribbon at the center of the bodice to achieve a similar effect. Here is the little bow I made. It was sewn on with a few hand stitches. At this point I did a fitting, and the whole top stitching thing hadn't really worked out. The ribbon gaped away from the orange material at the neckline, so I had to whip stitch them together by hand. Though this helped and definitely improves the appearance when it's on a dress form or laid flat, it still looks really awkward when it's worn. Satin ribbon, and the shanting strips that I used, are much stiffer than the recommended materials for this dress. Certainly they're stiffer than the rayon fabric I chose to use. And they also aren't cut on the bias, so they don't have any inclination to lay flat when the garment is worn. Instead, the neckline sticks up and away from the body and ends up looking like an awkward collar, which really doesn't go with the overall flowiness of this piece. So that's really disappointing. But now the bodice is done. And since the skirt was seamed together earlier, I could jump into the next step, which was stitch skirt flat on blouse. I'm not sure what they mean by stitch flat, but I aligned the notches and pinned the skirt to the bodice. Unfortunately, my gathering estimations were a little bit off. The waistline of the bodice was smaller than the waist of the skirt, but the waist of the bodice actually fit me, so I gathered the back of the skirt a little bit to get them to line up nicely. These were stitched by machine, and I chose to add a decorative belt, which isn't really a belt, it's just a rectangle sewn into the garment, but I think it looks nice. And this was just top stitched into position. Now for the placket. They didn't actually have instructions about this, so I used my own methods, which began with turning the edges inward by 1 inch. Then I cheated and stitched hook and eye tape into the interior of one side. And I sewed the eye tape into a folded piece of leftover material. Then I stitched that piece onto the fold of the other side opening. I realized this isn't the proper way to do a placket, but I didn't have enough hooks on hand to do it any other way, and I was worried about the tension they would put if I sewed them directly onto the fabric. I promise I will tackle several plackets using more traditional methods once we get to the 1940s. Just let me get away with cheating this one time, please. Now for the last step, which is turn 3-inch hem on skirt. But before doing that, I leveled the hem since it had warped quite badly when I had it hanging. After a quick trim, I folded the bottom edge inward by 1 inch, then inward by 1 inch again. Obviously, this only takes 2 inches of material, not 3 inches, but since I'm tall, I felt this would be more accurate. However, now that I've tried it on, I think it's a bit too long, so I might end up raising the hem by 1 inch or 2. In fact, I kind of want to redo the hem in general. I think after I hemmed it the first time, it put more weight on the bottom edge of the skirt, and it's actually warped more, so it's no longer even, which is annoying and probably something everyone is going to point out in the worn photos. I used a simple whip stitch to secure the hem, and again, this was recommended in the instructions, so it's what I did. And that is it for this dress. I ended up wearing it over a girdle from the 1930s, which I found on Etsy, along with a vintage bias cut slip. The finishing touches included matching lipstick, stud earrings, and a vintage hat. Along with a pair of T-strap shoes, which are from Phantasma and not comfortable, so I would not recommend them. I have really mixed feelings about how this dress turned out. It's more flattering than I was expecting based on my mock-up, but I feel like 1930s styles really idolize and flatter more narrow hips and broader shoulders. I think the styles look that great on me. Also, the belt looks a little bit puckered when it's worn, so I'm kind of tempted to remove it and give this dress a bit of a revamp with a separate belt and a buckle covered in matching material. And redoing that whole hem thing and fixing the ribbon around the collar. Even though I don't love the dress, the design is very 30s, and I like testing my skills with the inserted gathers and unique bodice/cape assembly. I feel like I learned things from this that I can incorporate into other projects and designs in the future. I was going to say that I might reattempt making this in the future with a few alterations, but I feel like I've said that about every pattern in this series so far, so it should probably just be assumed that I feel that way about pretty much everything that I make. I hope you enjoyed seeing me make this piece. I have a bonus project for this decade coming up soon, along with some other 30s themed videos. So I hope you'll stick around and subscribe for those. And if you'd like early access to those videos, as well as access to exclusive behind the scenes content, then please consider checking out my Patreon. Thanks so much for watching and all the kind feedback on this series so far, and I shall talk to all of you very soon.